Hello, so I have Appendix D to present, so I guess I'll just get into it. In Appendix D, grounded theory is used. Grounded theory is the use of data collection to explain an idea. Grounded theory is a qualitative research design which inquires and communicates an explanation of theory of a process, action, or interaction that is produced from a large number of participants. So, here's some statistics from Appendix D in this study. The sexual abuse of children appears to exist at a pandemic level, with estimates that 20% to 45% of women and 10 to 18% of men in the United States and Canada have been sexually abused as children. Experts agree with these figures and that they are underestimates of what the figures may actually be. There is a confusion surrounding treatments and methods because of the severity. So theoretical framework is needed to better understand the consequences of childhood sexual abuse. So approaching the study and survival of coping mechanisms allows us to possibly develop a framework that will help us consistently apply some techniques, making some techniques to these atrocities. Traditional coping theories often advertise the belittlement of emotion and often wanted to help avoid coping systems that were used by women's and abuse survivors. Bernard and Graham Birmingham really wanted to examine the power hierarchy in the coping process. Often the child who is a victim of abuse is powerless, and the attention must be paid to re-examining and understanding coping mechanisms with this type of population. The reason of this research was to understand experiences that women had to endure as children, and began a theoretical model for future survivors so that they can cope. Hashman noted that the qualitative research strategy was appropriate. Loftus wanted to urge the study of oppressed memories and urged psychologists and others that studied sexual abuse to recognize this nature. He also wanted to acknowledge the importance of his concerns addressing viability versus validity. Qualitative research methods are great for understanding the meaning that people associate with their experiences. Chosen to clarify participants' understandings of their abuse experiences, the message used involved developing a code, category, and theme inductively rather than imposing predetermined classifications of the data. So research participants were 11 women, ages ranging from 25 to 72, who had been sexually abused as children. One woman was African American, one was West Indian, and the remainder were Caucasian. 3 were lesbians, 1 was bisexual, and 7 were heterosexual. So they were gathered from southwestern metropolitan areas using therapists better known for survivors of abuse. 12 responders, 11 research participants. Each of the 11 survivors of sexual abuse participated in 60 to 90-minute independent, open-ended interviews, during which 2 were asked, Tell me as much as you are comfortable sharing with me right now. What happened to you when you were sexually abused? What are primary ways in which you survived? Merrill's responses included active listening, empathetic reflection, and minimal encouragers. 7 of these 11 interviewees became focus group participants. The group provided an interactive environment and focused on survival and coping. So Merrill's own subjective experiences were logged. All were examined, and each of the biases and assumptions were written down and analyzed. Documentary evidence completed the data set. The data consisted of journals, both kept during the research and also outside of the research. Data collection, analysis, and writing. A concern for the qualitative research is evidence adequacy, and that it's sufficient time in the field and effectiveness, the body of evidence. This means, how long we have with it. So the data consisted of over 220 hours of audio and videotapes, which documented more than 65 hours of interviews, 24 hours of group sessions, and 25 hours of follow-up interactions with the participants over a period of more than 16 months. There was also 16 hours of audio tapes, field notes, and reflections. Over 2,000 pages were transcribed, field notes, and documents shared by participants. The language of participants were categorized into vivo codes for survival and coping strategies. These codes were categorized and compared and contrasted, yielding increasingly complex and inclusive categories. So open coding was followed by axial coding. Process categories emerged and were assigned the category labels. Finally, selective coding ensued. So after all of this data was collected and criteria for cores, over a few years, the participants continued to meet, and they started developing coping mechanisms with each other and for each other. So, two conditions emerged and led to phenomenological experiences related to sexual abuse. These conditions were cultural norms and forms of sexual abuse. So as we read through the data, a lot of these experiences were written down, such as quotes like Paula was one of the participants, and her mother was often called very bad names like pig and worse by the father, who then abused Paula. And she's quoted saying, "My mother got right down to my face and said that he didn't do anything to you, did he?" And out of being as scared as she was, she said, "No, he didn't do anything to me." So a lot of these lives were studied, written down, and categorized, and a lot of the coping mechanisms by these survivors were written down and were used, or at least they tried to use them to help future survivors. So that is the study. I appreciate it.